You never expect to find death in a photograph. Stephen Brooks was just trying to capture a beautiful memory, a diving trip with his wife off the coast of Australia. The sun was brilliant, the ocean a shimmering mirror of blue, and the water was calm as the couple slipped beneath the surface. A destination? The century-old wreckage of the SS Maribel, a ship swallowed by the sea in 1911. The plan was simple: descend, explore, take some photos, then return to the surface alive. But what Stephen captured in his camera that day would not be just a memory. It would become evidence. Down in the depths, where light begins to dim and silence presses in from all sides, Stephen turned to photograph his wife posing near the wreckage. He adjusted his frame, smiled through his mask, and pressed the shutter. Click! And in that moment, that single frozen frame, he saw something off, something just barely visible in the background. Another diver, but this one wasn't moving. At first, Stephen dismissed it. Maybe it was just a trick of the water, a diver playing around, some prank. But even as the seconds passed, that figure didn't shift, didn't wave, didn't swim. It just floated, face up, motionless. Stephen blinked. It didn't make sense. Who lies still like that on the ocean floor? He felt a flicker of unease curl inside him. But still, it had to be a joke, right? Then, out of nowhere, another diver entered the scene. This new figure approached the body with a kind of eerie calm. Surely, this was the moment someone would step in, help, rescue. But no, the second diver looked at the lifeless figure and then simply let go. He turned and ascended toward the surface. Alone, Stephen watched it all unfold through a wall of blue. His heartbeat thudded. Was this part a drill? A diver simulation? Some kind of twisted underwater performance? It wasn't. That lifeless body was not part of any plan. It wasn't a mannequin. It wasn't a prank. It was a woman, a young woman, a newlywed. Her name was Emily Carter. And 11 days before this dive, she had walked down the aisle and promised her life to a man named Brandon Hale. And that second diver, the one who watched her sink and did nothing, that was Brandon, her husband. Let that sink in. On what should have been the happiest chapter of her life, her honeymoon, Emily Carter drowned in open water, while the man she trusted most surfaced without her. Just like that. No alarm. No escrime. No desperate attempt to bring her up. He resurfaced. He waited. He claimed the current was too strong. And Emily? She remained below, 90 feet down, her body gently resting against the sandy seafloor like a discarded memory. What happened next would send shockwaves across 2 continents. It would ignite a firestorm of suspicion, grief, and a relentless pursuit for truth. Because something about this story didn't add up. Witnesses started whispering. Inconsistencies piled up like debris on a wreck. And Emily's parents, back in Alabama, received the phone call that would shatter their world. Their daughter, their kind, beautiful, vibrant Emily, was gone. But the more they asked, the more they learned, the more they realized. Emily didn't just die. She was taken by someone who claimed to love her. And now, a single photo taken by chance, with a woman floating lifeless in the background, would become a haunting symbol of what really happened beneath the waves that day. Because Emily's story wasn't just tragic. It was sickeningly calculated. And as we peel back the layers of this horrifying case, from the obsessed courtship to the warning signs no one saw, to the stunning failures of justice, one thing becomes heartbreakingly clear. Emily Carter didn't stand a chance. Before the ocean took her, before the betrayal, before that final, suffocating dive, Emily Carter was a light in every room she entered. She was born on a cold February morning in 1977 in West Germany, where she spent the earliest, quietest days of her life in an orphanage. But fate had other plans for her. At just 3 years old, she was adopted by Richard and Linda Carter, a warm, devoted couple from Walker County, Alabama. The moment Emily arrived in their arms, she wasn't just a daughter, she was their miracle. They cherished her, nurtured her, raised her in a home filled with love and laughter. Even when they had to relocate a few times, first to Louisiana, then finally settling in Birmingham, The Carters remained a tight-knit family. Emily was a sweetheart, bright, curious, and gentle. She adored animals, volunteered with local shelters, and had a gift for making even the shyest person feel seen. She had this quiet strength, the kind that doesn't scream for attention, but radiates in everything it does. But life wasn't always easy for her. As a child, Emily was diagnosed with a heart condition, paroxysmal supraventricular tachycardia, or PSVT. It caused her heart to race unexpectedly, triggering chest pain, shortness of breath, and dizzy spells. It wasn't fatal, but it was frightening, and it meant that Emily had to live with caution, with boundaries. It meant her family constantly worried about her safety, especially when she pushed herself too hard. But Emily never let her condition define her. She worked harder, loved deeper, lived brighter. After graduating high school, she enrolled at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. She was ambitious, focused, and, at the time, engaged to a kind young man named Daniel Pierce, someone her family cautiously supported. But things changed. Someone new stepped into her life. Someone who wouldn't take no for an answer. His name was Brandon Hale. At first, Brandon was charming, friendly, a little intense, but that's not always a red flag, right? He introduced himself in one of Emily's classes, and almost instantly, he was captivated by her. He asked her out, then asked again and again, even though she told him she was engaged, even though he knew she was taken. He just kept showing up. Emily tried to be polite. She told him no. She told him she was committed to someone else. But Brandon's interest didn't cool. In fact, it intensified. He inserted himself into her life with a kind of quiet persistence, always there, always watching. Then, Emily's relationship with Daniel began to crumble. According to her mother, Linda, she had serious doubts about the engagement, and when her parents expressed concern, Emily listened. Eventually, she ended things with Daniel. It should have been a time of healing, a time to rediscover herself. But Brandon was waiting, like he had been all along. It was New Year's Eve, 2000 turning into 2001. Emily went to a party with her friends, hoping for a night of laughter and champagne. Instead, she ran into Brandon. And this time, when he asked her out, she said yes. At first, their relationship moved quickly. Too quickly. Emily's friends noticed that Brandon was intense, possessive, but he masked it under the guise of devotion. He made her feel wanted. He said all the right things. And for someone who just walked away from a long engagement, maybe that was enough. Maybe she wanted to believe someone truly adored her. But over time, cracks began to show. Brandon had a way of turning disagreements into guilt trips. He sulked when Emily made plans without him. He pushed her to do things outside her comfort zone, things she didn't even want to do, like scuba diving. You see, Brandon was obsessed with diving. Not just as a hobby, it was his identity. He trained at Oak Mountain State Park, got certified, learned rescue techniques. Emily? She couldn't care less about diving. And with her heart condition, it was dangerous. Her parents were horrified when they found out Brandon had talked her into lessons. But Emily wanted to please him. She didn't want to lose him. And so, despite their concerns, despite her own medical history, she enrolled in diving certification classes. She was terrified, but she did it. For Brandon. By the time she earned her basic certification, she still had little experience, just 5 dives total. And none of them were in the open ocean. Still, Brandon pushed. Harder. They'd been dating for 3 years when Brandon proposed in April of 2003. And even though her father refused to give his blessing, Emily said yes. Because love makes us believe in things we shouldn't. But nothing prepared her parents for what came next. Just months after getting engaged, Emily sat down with her father and asked him something strange. She asked him to increase her life insurance and name Brandon as the sole beneficiary. Richard was stunned. Why the rush? Why now? He tried to hide his unease, assuring her they could talk about it after the wedding and honeymoon. For now, he said, just focus on being happy. And so, on October 11th, 2003, Emily Carter became Emily Hale. She smiled in her white dress. Her parents forced their smiles through an ache in their chests, because something just didn't feel right. And when Brandon revealed that their honeymoon would be a scuba diving trip to the Great Barrier Reef, That ache only grew deeper. Emily wasn't excited. She was afraid. But she agreed to go, because that's what love asked of her. A honeymoon, a sacred celebration of love. A once-in-a-lifetime adventure where two souls start a journey meant to last forever. But for Emily Hale, her honeymoon would be her last. It was supposed to be paradise, Australia's Great Barrier Reef, a dream destination for divers around the world. But Emily didn't dream of diving. Not really. The open ocean scared her. She was barely trained. Her heart condition had always been a shadow. But she said yes, because he wanted it. Brandon Hale, her new husband, couldn't stop talking about the dive. He obsessed over the details. He bragged to friends about the wreck they would visit. The SS Maribel, a ship that had sunk over 90 years earlier, now resting silently 98 feet below the surface. Almost 4 times deeper than Emily had ever gone before. Let that sink in. Brandon had completed 55 dives. Emily had done 5. 5. All of them in calm, shallow, freshwater lakes. None in the unpredictable, turbulent sea. None in currents. None in pressure that squeezed your chest like a vice. She wasn't ready, but that didn't matter to Brandon. They arrived in Townsville, Queensland, and boarded a boat named the Horizon Star. It would be their base for the dive. Aboard were experienced divers, crew members, instructors, all there to ensure safety, guidance, support. But Brandon? He didn't want help. He and Emily refused the offered guided dive. They skipped orientation. No safety briefing. No expert at their side. Brandon insisted they were fine. He was certified. He knew what he was doing. And Emily? She trusted him. But there was one more thing. Just before the dive, Brandon approached the crew and made a specific request. He asked for additional weights to be added to Emily's buoyancy vest. Otherwise, he said, she won't descend properly. Now, any experienced diver knows, too much weight can be dangerous. It drags you down fast. It makes it harder to float back up if something goes wrong, especially for someone as small, as light, and as inexperienced as Emily. But Brandon insisted, and the crew complied. Emily didn't question it. Why would she? Her husband was the expert. And then they jumped in. At first, all seemed normal. But just minutes into the descent, something happened. According to Brandon, Emily began to panic. He claimed she looked terrified, her eyes wide behind her mask. She flailed her arms. He said she accidentally knocked the regulator from his mouth, the device delivering his oxygen, and disrupted his mask. He turned away for just a moment. And when he looked back, Emily was gone, sinking, drifting toward the ocean floor like a broken doll. Brandon says he tried. He says the current was too strong, that he couldn't reach her, that he had no choice but to surface and get help. But Brandon Hale was a rescue diver. Let that sit with you. A man specifically trained to save others in the water. Left his wife sinking below. He didn't scream for help. He didn't rush to pull her up. He surfaced alone, calmly, and left her behind. 10 minutes passed. 10 whole minutes. And finally, it wasn't Brandon, but Marcus Reed, a dive instructor who dove in and pulled Emily back to the surface. But by then, it was too late. Emily was unconscious, her body limp. A doctor aboard rushed to her side and began CPR. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 30 minutes, 40 minutes. But nothing worked. She was gone. Emily Hale was dead. Just 11 days after saying "I do," she died alone at the bottom of the ocean, while her husband stood above, breathing freely, untouched by panic, untouched by grief. Witnesses were confused, stunned, unsettled. Brandon didn't act like a man who just lost his bride. He wasn't clutching her hand. He wasn't screaming or sobbing by her side. No, he was curled up in the corner of the boat, asking strangers for hugs. No tears, no urgency, just empty theatrics. And when Emily's lifeless body was laid on the deck, Brandon didn't even kneel beside her, didn't kiss her forehead, didn't say goodbye. He just looked away. One diver later recalled watching Brandon float to the surface after abandoning Emily and described it as eerily calm, almost smug. Another diver, Nathan Lowell, remembered seeing Brandon grab Emily in a bear hug underwater. Not a loving embrace, but something controlling, something desperate. He said Emily was struggling, kicking. Then suddenly, she was still. And Brandon? He let go and swam away, as if nothing had happened. Back on land, there were no sirens, no questions. Not yet, but the whispers had already begun. What had really happened in those final, silent minutes? Why would a trained rescue diver abandon his wife without even trying? And why did Brandon Hale insist on adding extra weight to her vest? As the boat pulled away from the dive site, one thing had become horribly clear. This was not a tragic accident. This was a setup, and Emily Hale had never stood a chance. The sun rose quietly over the Coral Sea on the morning of October 22nd, 2003. It should have been another perfect day in paradise. But beneath the glimmering surface of that endless blue, a nightmare was about to unfold. Emily Hale, just 11 days into her new life as a wife, climbed aboard the Horizon Star with her husband Brandon. She smiled politely to the crew, maybe a little nervously. She had reason to be. This wasn't just any dive. It was an advanced, open-ocean descent to the sunken remains of the SS Maribel, nearly 100 feet below. Emily had never been that deep before. In fact, the deepest she'd ever gone was 30 feet in calm lake water. Now, she was being asked to more than triple that in wild, unfamiliar ocean. It didn't matter that she was inexperienced, or that she had a heart condition, or that she had voice concerns before. Brandon had already made the decisions. He had the plan. He had control. And Emily, as always, just followed. They suited up. Brandon, ever the self-proclaimed expert, checked his gear with confidence. Then, just before entering the water, he adjusted Emily's weight belt again. Extra pounds. To help her descend better, he said. No one questioned it. No one stopped him. Not even Emily. And then they jumped. The descent was slow at first. Bubbles rose in bursts. Schools of fish darted through filtered beams of light. For a moment, it seemed peaceful, even beautiful. But somewhere, as they dropped deeper into the cold shadow of the wreck, something shifted. According to Brandon, Emily looked scared. He said her eyes widened. She began to panic. Her hands flailed. She accidentally knocked his air regulator loose, dislodged his mask. He struggled to recover. And we finally fixed his gear. She was already sinking, motionless, drifting. He didn't chase her. He didn't grab her. He didn't try. Brandon claimed the current was too strong, that he couldn't reach her, that the only thing he could do was go back up and get help. He was a rescue diver, and he swam away. Let that haunt you. He surfaced alone. No shouts, no panique, just surfaced. Crew members noticed his composure. Strange, they thought. Where was Emily? Had something gone wrong? That's when Marcus Reed, a professional dive instructor, sprang into action. Without hesitation, he dove back down. What he found was horrifying. Emily lay flat on her back on the seafloor, her eyes wide, her limbs still. There was no movement, no sign of life. Marcus acted fast. He removed her weights. Over 20 pounds strapped to her vest, more than double what she needed. He pulled her limp body to the surface and dragged her onto a nearby boat, the Coral Bell. A doctor was there. Thank God. But even with immediate CPR, nothing. They tried for 40 minutes. But Emily was already gone. Dead. Lost to the sea. The dive team was in shock. So were the passengers. How could this have happened so fast? She was a young woman. Healthy. Alive one moment, gone the next. And Brandon? Brandon stayed distant. Detached. Witnesses say he curled up in a corner. He asked other divers for hugs. He whimpered. He rocked. But no one saw tears. Not one. More disturbingly, he never once approached Emily's body. Not to hold her hand. Not to kiss her forehead. Not to whisper goodbye. She lay there, alone. Her husband standing feet away, doing nothing. Even after death, Emily's dignity was neglected. But it didn't stop there. Back on the mainland, as the shock of her death began to settle in, the stories, the real stories, started to surface. One diver, Nathan Lowell, had seen something strange. He remembered Brandon underwater, holding Emily in what he described as a bear hug. Not romantic, not tender, controlling, tight, aggressive. Emily was struggling, he said, kicking, pushing, desperate. And then she stopped. Nathan watched, frozen, as Brandon let go and swam upward. Without her. And then came the photograph. Stephen Brooks, another diver aboard the Horizon Star, had been photographing his wife near the shipwreck when he captured something chilling in the background. A diver, face up, lifeless, floating. It was Emily, frozen in time, suspended in the deep. A ghost. That photograph, haunting and surreal, became the grim symbol of everything that went wrong on that dive. And back home in Alabama, Richard and Linda Carter, Emily's parents, were about to receive the call that would shatter their world. But it wasn't Brandon who called. It was his parents. Not a single word from the man who'd just lost his wife. No voice trembling with grief. No desprite palegi. Just a cold, second-hand message. Their daughter, their Emily, was gone. And the questions had only just begun.
Grief has a sound. It trembles. It wails. It shatters the silence with sobs that come from the gut, from the soul. But what Brandon Hale gave the world in the hours after Emily's death wasn't grief. It was theater. Witnesses described him as distressed, but strangely hollow. He rocked in a corner of the dive boat, asked fellow divers for hugs, and mumbled incoherently. But not once did anyone see tears. There were no screams, no trembling hands holding Emily's. No last, "I love you." No desperate plea to the doctor performing CPR. Just a man performing sadness, pretending to feel something. The doctor tried. He tried for 40 excruciating minutes to bring Emily back. Chest compressions, oxygen, everything he had. But her body wouldn't respond. She was cold, gone. And Brandon? He hovered in the background like a man watching a movie, distant, expressionless, disconnected. When they told him she hadn't made it, there was no collapse, no scream of denial. Instead, he turned his back. Quiet, passive. It was the dive instructor, Marcus Reed, who had pulled Emily's lifeless body from the ocean floor. Not her husband. It was the doctor who fought to revive her, not the man who had vowed to protect her. Brandon Hale had stood by and done nothing, and the whispers only grew louder. One diver recalled how oddly calm Brandon was as he surfaced, just minutes after leaving his wife behind underwater. He didn't look frantic. He didn't call for help right away. He simply floated upward, like a man returning from a casual swim. And then came the damning details. Emily's weight belt. When Marcus brought her up, he found she'd been wearing over 20 pounds of lead, twice what she should have had for her size. That extra weight? It would have made her descent faster, harder to control, and her ability to float back to the surface nearly impossible. Who had insisted on that extra weight? Brandon. He claimed it was necessary to help her descend. But seasoned divers on the boat were horrified when they learned how much weight Emily had been carrying. She never stood a chance, one crew member whispered. Then came the bear hug. Nathan Lowell, another diver in the water that day, had witnessed something deeply unsettling. He saw Brandon underwater, grabbing Emily tightly, not like a husband holding his wife, but like someone trying to control her. She was flailing, Nathan said, struggling, kicking, then suddenly limp, and Brandon let go, just like that. He swam up, and she sank. Another diver, Stephen Brooks, had captured a photograph of his wife near the wreck. But in the corner of that image, a disturbing silhouette. A diver, lying flat, face up, not moving. Emily. The photo would later go viral. It didn't just freeze a moment. It froze a death. A still, horrifying portrait of betrayal, caught on camera by accident. It was undeniable now. This wasn't just an accident. Something was wrong. Back home in Alabama, Richard and Linda Carter were drowning in disbelief. They hadn't even heard the news from Brandon himself. It was his parents who called. Imagine that. The man who'd taken their daughter on a honeymoon dive, who returned without her, couldn't even bring himself to speak to her family. And when the Carters attended Emily's funeral just days later, they were met with something even more horrifying. Brandon's behavior. It was, in a word, vile. He made sexual remarks about Emily's body, right there, at her funeral, while friends and family wept, while her parents clutched tissues and photographs. Brandon joked, smirked, made people uncomfortable. One guest described him as more concerned with being the center of attention than mourning his wife. Another said it felt like he was already over it. And then, just days after her funeral, Brandon submitted a claim to the travel insurance company. Not for grief counseling, not for trauma. No, he wanted money. $45,000. For trip interruption, for medical expenses, for taxi fares, credit card statement fees, and accidental death coverage. Emily had barely been in the ground, but Brandon had already done the math. He had planned to receive her life insurance payout, too. Remember, months before the wedding, Emily had asked her father to increase her policy and name Brandon as the sole beneficiary. But Richard had hesitated. Something hadn't felt right. He promised to revisit it after the honeymoon. He never did, and thank God for that, because Brandon wasn't getting a penny. But this wasn't over, not by a long shot. As strange as Brandon's behavior had been, what would come next would turn suspicion into fury, grief into obsession, and one father's pain into a crusade for truth. Because Richard Carter had questions, and he wasn't going to stop until someone answered them. Not even if it meant flying across the world. Not even if it meant going up against a man who had married and buried his only daughter. When a loved one dies unexpectedly, the world stops. For most people. But for Brandon Hale, the death of his wife Emily didn't seem to derail much of anything. In fact, he moved on shockingly fast. And even as friends whispered and parents mourned Brandon's story, the one story that should have stayed consistent began to shift. Over and over again, witnesses, police, even casual listeners noticed that every time Brandon opened his mouth, a new version of the truth came out. First, he said Emily panicked. Then, he said she was calm but unresponsive. Later, he claimed she yanked his regulator out. Then later, he wasn't sure that even happened. One moment, he said he tried to help. The next, he said he didn't know how. He told 16 different versions of what happened underwater. 16. Let that number rattle around in your mind. Even the police in Townsville, Australia, were baffled. At first, they ruled it an accident. The autopsy hadn't been definitive. The dive logs were unclear. Brandon had been the only one with her. And grief, they thought, can make people act strangely. But something just didn't sit right. So when Richard Carter, Emily's father, flew to Australia, he wasn't just bringing flowers. He was bringing fire. He visited the dive site, spoke to the crew, reviewed the logs, looked through the police reports. He wasn't a detective, just a dad with instincts. And his gut told him this was no accident. And finally, the authorities started listening. They went back through everything, this time with suspicion. And what they found was damning. First, the autopsy. It was conducted by Dr. Alan Whitaker, a respected forensic pathologist. And his findings were strange. There was very little water in Emily's lungs, which is odd because when someone drowns, their lungs typically fill with water. That's how it works. But in Emily's case, there was hardly any. So if she didn't drown, what had happened? There was no evidence her heart condition played a role either. Instead, Dr. Whitaker noted the presence of air embolisms, air bubbles trapped in her blood vessels, possibly caused by a rapid change in pressure. Dangerous, deadly, and highly suspicious, especially for someone who was supposedly descending slowly and carefully. Then there were the dive computers. These digital devices record everything, depth, time, movements, like a black box in an airplane. Emily's computer confirmed what everyone feared. She wasn't prepared for that dive. She descended too fast, too deep. She wasn't trained for it. But Brandon's dive computer told a different kind of story. He had told police that he'd rushed to the surface as fast as possible to get help. But the data showed otherwise. Brandon ascended slowly, leisurely, as if he wasn't in a hurry at all, as if there was no emergency waiting above. What kind of rescue diver moves slowly while their wife is drowning? One that already knew it was too late. And then came the rumors, the sightings at Emily's grave. At first, no one said anything. Grief affects people in strange ways. But it wasn't long before the family noticed something bizarre. The flowers were disappearing, again and again. The bouquets they left on Emily's grave vanished. Cards, notes, Tributes. Gone. It kept happening. So often, they had to start chaining down the arrangements. Until finally, the police stepped in. They installed a small, hidden camera near Emily's resting place. And what it recorded was not shocking anymore. Not to them. It was Brandon, caught on tape, stealing flowers from his dead wife's grave, stuffing cards and memorials into trash bags, walking away as if it were a chore, as if it meant nothing. When confronted, Brandon shrugged it off. She didn't like plastic flowers, he said. Plastic flowers. But he didn't stop there. In 2007, he exhumed Emily's body, moved her to a plot under his own name, without telling her parents. And then, for 2 years, he left her grave unmarked. No headstone, no inscription, no sign that she had ever existed. 2 full years. It took Richard Carter going to court just to get a foot marker placed. And even then, Brandon wasn't finished being cruel. When Richard asked for Emily's belongings, her clothes, her journals, her keepsakes, Brandon refused. Flat out refused. It took another legal battle to get back the pieces of his daughter's life. At every step, Brandon resisted. Mocked. Dismissed. As if none of it mattered. But the worst was still coming. Because now, investigators were connecting the dots. The extra weight. The bear hug. The air turn off. Then possibly turn back on once Emily was unconscious. A theory that would explain the small amount of water in her lungs. According to experts, it looked like Brandon may have shut off Emily's oxygen, waited, then reopened the valve just enough for her mouth to fill a little as she sank, enough to make it look like a drowning. It was chillingly methodical, but without a confession, it was all circumstantial. And so far, Brandon had never cracked, never admitted a thing. Still, the evidence, the behavior, the inconsistencies, the cold-hearted indifference, it was mounting. And the authorities in Australia were ready to take action. But justice? Justice was going to be complicated. Richard Carter was not a man who backed down. He had walked his daughter down the aisle. He had trusted that her smile that day meant she was safe, that she was loved, that she had a future. And 11 days later, he was burying her. No father should ever have to do that. And certainly not under these circumstances. Not with a son-in-law who showed no real emotion, no real remorse, and no interest in answering even the most basic questions. So Richard did what no grieving father should ever have to do. He became a detective. He pored over dive records, interviewed witnesses, traveled back to Australia, pressed investigators to take another look. And finally, they listened. It was July 2004, nearly a year after Emily's death, when authorities in Townsville officially reclassified her case. No longer an accident. Now, a homicide investigation. The shift was seismic. Every detail was re-examined. Every witness re-interviewed. Every piece of Brandon Hale's story compared against the physical evidence and found wanting. The contradictions were glaring. His dive log said one thing. His mouth said another. He claimed to ascend quickly, but his dive computer said otherwise. He said he tried to help Emily, but not one person could verify it. Not a single diver remembered seeing him panic, or even shout. He claimed to be a rescue diver, but later admitted he had never learned how to bring a distressed diver to the surface. Wait, what? That's like saying you're a firefighter, but you never learned how to use a hose. Even the dive certification school confirmed Brandon had only completed 15 open water dives in total. 15. And this was the man who convinced Emily, a woman with a heart condition and barely any ocean experience, to plunge 98 feet into a wreck dive? Unforgivable. The deeper they looked, the more disturbing things they uncovered. Brandon had been obsessed with Emily from the moment they met. He had pursued her while she was engaged to someone else. Friends described him as relentless. Not romantic, obsessive. And when they finally did start dating, the relationship was rocky. They broke up frequently, fought often. One time, he even threw a pizza at her face during a fight. Another time, he berated her for going out with friends while they were separated, then begged her to come back. It was a toxic cycle, but Emily had always been kind, forgiving, too forgiving. When she finally said yes to his proposal, her parents were stunned, deeply uncomfortable, but they hoped He would grow into the man she believed he could be. He didn't. Instead, in the months before the wedding, he asked her to push for more life insurance. And then, on the honeymoon, he led her into deep waters and came back alone. Now, with the evidence piling up, Australia was ready to move. They filed the paperwork, and soon, Brandon Hale was arrested in the United States. But justice came with a price. To extradite him to Australia, authorities had to agree to reduce the charges. Instead of murder, Brandon would be charged with manslaughter. It felt like a slap, but it was better than nothing. And so, in 2008, Brandon stood before an Australian court. He pleaded guilty. He admitted to failing in his duty to protect his wife during the dive. Not to harming her, not to planning it, just failing. And the sentence? 4.5 years. 4.5 years for the death of a woman he was sworn to protect. But he only served 18 months before being released. 18 months. That's what Emily's life was worth in the eyes of the law. But Richard Carter didn't stop, because there was still more evidence. More Brandon had done after Emily's death. The flower theft, the unmarked grave, the exhumation without consent, the refusal to return her belongings, the inappropriate jokes at her funeral. So the United States pressed charges as well. The goal, try him again in Alabama for murder with new evidence. But there was a catch. To get him extradited from Australia, prosecutors had agreed not to seek the death penalty. Fine. But when the trial finally happened in 2012, it collapsed before it could even begin. The judge ruled that key evidence, including the insurance claim, the grave tampering, and Brandon's behavior after the death, could not be introduced. Why? To this day, no one really knows. And without that evidence, the case was too weak to hold. Brandon Hale walked free. He returned to Alabama. He remarried. To this day, he lives in the same house Emily once dreamed of building a life in. A house that, technically, she helped him secure after her death. Can you imagine? A man walks free. After all of it. After the lies, the silence, the staged grief, the calculated dive, the whispers at sea, the cold-hearted performance. He walks free, and her family, the ones who loved her most, are left with a grave, a headstone, and a lifetime of unanswered questions. There are crimes that end in justice. And then, there are crimes that leave you gasping for answers that never come. Emily Hale's death was one of those. Because despite the investigations, the inconsistencies, the gut-wrenching evidence, her killer got away with it. Let's not sugarcoat it. Let's not call it a tragedy or an accident or a case of poor judgment, like so many headlines did. Let's call it what it was. A murder. Planned. Calculated. Executed beneath the waves, in a place where no one could hear her scream. Emily Hale died 98 feet below the surface, flailing, fighting, panicking. Her air possibly turned off. Her weight belt overloaded. Her inexperience exploited. She died surrounded by blue silence. And the one man who should have saved her, the man who held her hand at the altar, who promised forever, didn't lift a finger. He swam away. And then? He cried fake tears. He asked for hugs. He filed insurance claims. He mocked her at her funeral. He stole from her grave. He exhumed her body like it was nothing. He married someone new. He moved into the house she helped pay for. And he never said he was sorry. He never confessed, never admitted what he did. Because in Brandon Hale's mind, he won. In his twisted world, 18 months behind bars was a blip. A price worth paying to start fresh. A short pause before freedom. But for Richard and Linda Carter, for Emily's friends, her family, everyone who knew her, the nightmare never ended. They didn't just lose a daughter. They lost justice. They lost the comfort of knowing her killer had truly been held accountable. They lost faith in a system that let someone walk free. Not because he was innocent, but because the evidence that proved he was guilty wasn't admissible. What do you say to a father who spends years chasing truth, only to watch a courtroom door swing shut with no resolution? What do you tell a mother who sat through trials, hearings, and motions, only to hear a judge say the case was too weak? What do you tell a sister, a best friend, who still wakes up hearing Emily's laugh in dreams? What do you say to a woman who did everything right, who followed love, who tried to be supportive, who took diving lessons despite her fear, despite her heart condition, just to make her husband happy. What do you say to a woman who died trying to be enough for a man who didn't deserve her? There are no words. There is only grief and fury and the aching emptiness of what could have been. Emily never wanted to dive that deep. She wasn't ready. She had said so. But Brandon pushed. Because that's what abusers do. They control. They pressure. They convince you that your fears don't matter. That your discomfort is weakness. That your instincts are wrong. And in the end, they leave you isolated, afraid, and vulnerable. When Emily descended into that water, she was carrying more than just physical weight. She was carrying the weight of a toxic relationship, the pressure to please, the silent scream of instincts ignored. And she never came back. But here's what did come back. A photo, a bare hug, a fake cry, a missing bouquet, a smirk, a joke, a second wife. And still, Brandon Hale walks free. He lives in Hoover, Alabama, in the same neighborhood where Emily once walked barefoot across a lawn, dreaming of her future. He smiles for photos. He waves at neighbors. He talks about moving on. But we won't, because stories like Emily's don't fade. They burn. They burn with every unanswered question, with every denied admission, with every courtroom door that's slammed too soon. This isn't just about one woman. It's about every woman who gave too much, who ignored the red flags, who made excuses for cruelty, who said, maybe he'll change. It's about fathers who bury daughters, and courts that fail them. It's about asking how many more women will go diving into deep water for love and never surface? How many more Brandons will wear suits in courtrooms and walk out whistling? How many more Emilys will be remembered by the silence they left behind? This story ends in heartbreak. It ends in injustice. But it cannot end in silence. Because if we forget Emily Hale, if we forget what happened 98 feet below the surface, if we stop telling her story, then Brandon Hale wins again. And that we cannot allow.